It's the Resistance Report for October 23rd, 2017, where we connect the dots. And tonight we're discussing Trump's tax plan, but more specifically, we're discussing the power big money has in Washington. And big money, basically, under Donald Trump, has taken over Washington. Big money now rules Washington. It's been ruling Washington for many, many years. Here's a big bag of big money. But basically, now it is entirely in control. It's almost been a year since Donald Trump was elected President of the United States. Remember when he promised to drain the swamp? Now, the largest corporations and richest people in America who donated billions of dollars to Republican candidates in the House and Senate in the 2016 election may be on the way to getting what they paid for, a giant tax cut. The New York Times reports that business groups are meeting frequently with key Republicans in order to shape the next tax bill, whose details remain secret.
An army of lobbyists will come to protect the special interest provisions and to derail tax reform.
What is Paul Ryan actually talking about? The special interests he mentions. I mean, he wants to sound like, look like an anti-establishment fighter. Those special interests are the forces behind the tax cut he's arranging for them. These special interests are the moneyed interests. Big corporations, Wall Street, the very rich, they are the same who are bankrolling Paul Ryan and the entire Republican Party and, unfortunately, much of the Republican and Democratic Party. He's not standing up to anybody. Corporate lobbyists and the GOP's wealthy donors, they stand to make a fortune from Trump's and the Republicans' tax cuts, and they are doing everything they can to make those happen. And speed and secrecy. They're going to do it as quickly and as quietly as they possibly can. Speed and secrecy are of the essence. The quicker Republicans get this done, and without hearings, there are not going to be any hearings, the less likely will the rest of the country discover how much it will cost us in foregone Medicaid and Medicare or ballooning budget deficits. You see, it's only the rich, the very rich. I want to just make sure you get this and repeat it over and over again. The top 1%, they're going to get an average yearly tax cut of $129,000. That's the top 1%. The typical American is going to get a tax cut of something in the order of $55 a year to maybe if they are lucky, $450 a year. That's the typical American. This is the top 1%. These are the special interests that Paul Ryan is talking about, who stand to make a bundle. The problem is Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. That's where some of this is going to be financed from. They are already in trouble because a massive wave of baby boomers are about to retire. Social Security and Medicare, they make up 40% of federal spending. So we got Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. Now, over the next decade, another 15 million Americans will become eligible for these programs, blowing a huge hole in the deficit by cutting taxes for the rich and wealthy corporations is not going to help. This hole is going to get bigger and bigger even as it is. Now, since he was elected almost a year ago, Donald Trump has been trashing democratic institutions. All he can. I mean, the independence of the press, judges who disagree with him, uncooperative legislators, while raking in money off his presidency. And creating a presidency, by the way, that is all about him, not about you or me or Americans or anybody else, all about him. But listen, we mustn't lose sight of the larger attack on our democracy that was underway even before Trump was elected. It's the flood of big money into American politics. I mean, Trump was partly elected because of this, because people think the whole system is so rotten. Unless you conclude it's only Republicans who have been pocketing big bucks in exchange for political favors, consider what big tech, the industry that's mostly bankrolled Democrats, is up to. So, big tech. And by big tech, we're talking about Facebook and Google and Twitter and Apple and Amazon and so on. They are opposed to something that Senators John McCain and Amy Klobuchar, this is a bipartisan move. They have proposed a law requiring Google, Facebook, and other major internet companies to disclose who is purchasing their online political advertising.
Our bill, the Honest Ads Act, would bring transparency and accountability to paid political advertising by simply extending the current disclosure laws to those when they're run online. It is fair and it's the right thing to do. So what does it do? 1, updates our laws to ensure that political ads sold online are covered by the same rules. 2, requires online platforms with millions of users to maintain a public file so people know what is in these ads. And it would require online platforms to do a better job of policing their sites to ensure that the laws which prevent foreign nationals from influencing our elections are not being violated.
Now, big tech is mobilizing an army of lobbyists and lawyers, including senior advisors to Hillary Clinton's campaign, to help scuttle this law. After revelations that Russian-linked operatives bought deceptive ads in the run-up to the 2016 election, you would think that this law would be a no-brainer. But never underestimate the power of big money, whichever side of the aisle it's aimed at. Over the last 3 months, Facebook, Google, and Amazon have bolstered their lobbying spending in Washington. Facebook spent $2.8 million. This is 2.85, and this is just in the last quarter of 2017, according to the latest data we have. That's up from 41% in the same period last year, according to disclosure reports made public Friday. Google doled out $4.17 million on lobbying between just July and September. That's a 9% jump. Google's increase, by the way, comes as it faces the largest fine the European Union has ever levied against a company for abusing its dominant market position. This summer, the European Union's antitrust chief hit Google with a $2.7 billion fine for illegally steering users toward its comparison shopping site. Google is appealing the decision. Amazon spent $3.4 million just from July 1st to September 30th. And on and on and on and on. You see, it's not just Wall Street. It's also big tech. It's not just Republicans. It is also Democrats. Amazon has spent more than it has ever spent in a single quarter. Apple spent $1.86 million in the third quarter. That's up 73% from last year. Washington is awash in corporate money. Last Tuesday, Donald Trump announced that Representative Tom Marino from Pennsylvania, his nominee for drug czar, was withdrawing. Now, Marino's withdrawal came in the wake of an investigative report detailing how Marino helped pass legislation weakening the Drug Enforcement Administration's ability to go after drug distributors, even as opioid-related deaths continue to rise. The Washington Post and 60 Minutes reported that Big Pharma contributed close to $1.5 million to Democrats as well as Republicans. So we've got big tech, big pharma, we've got all of the corporations that are going to get huge advantages from this tax cut. Big pharma, by the way, made these contributions in order to secure enactment of the so-called, and here's a great name, Ensuring Patient Access and Effective Drug Enforcement Act of 2016. Marino, who shepherded the bill, got $100,000 from the industry. This shameful law weakened the drug enforcement authorities' power to stop prescription opioids from being shipped to pharmacies and doctors suspected of taking bribes to distribute them, which is a major cause of the opioid crisis. Last year alone, Americans got 236 million opioid prescriptions. That's the equivalent of about one bottle for every adult American. But here's the thing. There was no opposition to this bill from congressional Republicans or Democrats. Virtually all of them voted for it, and President Obama, not President Trump, President Obama, signed it into law. So there you have it, folks. Whether we're talking about Wall Street, or we're talking about big pharma, or we're talking about big tech, or we're talking about all of the companies, big companies and wealthy people that are going to make a huge amount with regard to the tax cut. Whether you're talking about allowing Russia to interfere in future elections, whether you're talking about killing Americans with opioids, all of this is just the tip of the corrupt iceberg that is sinking our democracy. Republicans may be making and taking more big money than Democrats, but both parties have been raking it in. Average Americans know exactly what's going on. Look, I just returned from several days in Kentucky and Tennessee, both of which voted overwhelmingly for Donald Trump in 2016. A number of Trump voters told me they voted for him because they wanted somebody who would shake up Washington, who would drain the swamp, who would get rid of crony capitalism. They saw Hillary Clinton as part of the problem. Now, these people are not white nationalists. They're decent folks who just wanted a government that was not of, by, and for the moneyed interests. Now, many of them are now suffering buyer's remorse. They recognize that Trump has sold his administration to corporate lobbyists in Wall Street even more than any previous administration. He conned us, was the most polite response I heard in Kentucky and in Tennessee. The big money that's taken over American politics in recent years has created the biggest political backlash in post-war American history. Inside both parties. It's splitting the Republican Party between its large corporate patrons and a base that detests big corporations and Wall Street. And the base detests corporations and Wall Street because the base basically wants a system that is fair, a system that will work for everybody. Trump is trying to straddle both in the Republican Party by pretending he's a champion of the working class. At the same time, he's pushing for giant tax cuts. But if my free-floating focus group in Kentucky and Tennessee are any indication, the base is starting to see right through it. Now, which you might think creates a huge opportunity for Democrats heading into the 2018 midterms and the presidential election of 2020. right? Well, think again. Much of the official Democratic Party is still in denial. They are continuing to debate whether the Democrats should be on the proverbial left or move to the center. That is the biggest issue among Democrats. Do we stay on the left or do we move to the center? And when they're not talking about whether they're staying on the left or moving to the center, they're talking about what their message ought to be. But when it comes to getting big money out of politics and ending crony capitalism, there is no right or left, and certainly no center. There's just democracy or oligarchy. I think Democrats ought to be fighting for common sense steps to reclaim our democracy from the moneyed interests. I mean, everything from public financing of elections, full disclosure of all sources of political funding, an end to the revolving door between business and government, and attempts to reverse that bonkers Supreme Court decision, Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission. For that matter, Republicans should be fighting for these things too. Here is a wild idea. What if the anti-establishment wings of both parties possibly came together? I'm talking about the anti-establishment wings of both parties that basically want to get rid of crony capitalism. They don't want a system that's fixed by big monies. They get together, maybe, and I'm not talking about the white supremacists. I'm not talking about the racists. I'm not talking about the xenophobes. I'm talking about the people in both anti-establishment wings of both parties that want to get our democracy back. If they ever got together, it might actually happen. And that may not be as far-fetched as it sounds right now. And now for your questions, which I have not seen, but I am now. Ben Cohn, will any tax cut, tax break, or reform, no matter how inconsequential, be big enough and a big enough political win for Republicans to claim legislative victory with a base and save their conservative bona fides going into 2018? Well, Ben, that's certainly what they are counting on. I mean, they could not deliver to their base what they thought they had promised their base. Their base, was drummed into a lather about the Affordable Care Act, and they said they would repeal and replace it with something much better. You remember that was what Donald Trump kept on saying in the 2016 election, and they couldn't. They couldn't repeal it. They certainly couldn't replace it with something much better. So they have got to deliver tax cuts, and what they're trying to do is convince the base, convince the working class in America, and convince the Republican middle class that they are going to get a big tax cut, but it's based on lies and more lies and more lies. Well, if the base wakes up and sees what's going on and sees that there's just more rewards for the swamp of Washington and for big corporations and the wealthy and Wall Street, then the base is not going to reward the Republicans. Bernadette Colquhoun, I hope you don't think this is a silly question. Bernadette, your questions are never silly. But what is supply-side economics? Trickle-down is self-explanatory. Bernadette, supply-side economics is trickle-down economics. I mean, supply-side economics, as it came out of the brain of Arthur Laffer, economist Arthur Laffer, conservative supply-side economist, was the notion that if you give the rich tax breaks, that will grow the economy, and the benefits of that growth will trickle down to everybody else. Unfortunately for Arthur Laffer, unfortunately for supply-side economists, unfortunately for the Republican Party that keeps on coming up with this harebrained idea, we have tried it. Ronald Reagan tried it. George W. Bush tried it. And you know something? The economy barely grew at all. It did grow because of Ronald Reagan's military Keynesianism, that is his spending, huge spending on the military. But that's not the kind of growth you really want. George W. Bush, there was almost no growth. In fact, the economy, wages actually went nowhere, jobs went nowhere, the economy ended up in a gigantic recession. Supply-side economics is one of those unfortunate economic theories to have been tried in practice and shown how bankrupt it actually is. Ryan Gregory Casey, what do you think of the bidding war happening between U.S. cities for Amazon's next headquarters. Should cities give Amazon a tax break for the money it will bring in? Ryan, I would say no. This is just a giant zero-sum game. Amazon's not going to create any more jobs in the United States. It's going to just allocate the jobs differently. I mean, so what? Suppose one state X, gets the jobs and state Y doesn't get the jobs. There's the same number of jobs. This is a huge bit of corporate welfare. Let's call it what it is, for Amazon. And those tax breaks that Amazon gets will come out of your services, if you are a state that gets Amazon, or will come out of a bigger budget deficit, or will come out of whatever else you need to pay for, or you're going to have to make up the difference with more tax payments by yourself, on your own. C.B. Ramakandran, I've heard the argument about a livable wage for all Americans as a baseline, and I'm conflicted. How would this affect salaried workers, school tuition, and other factors? CB, there's been a lot of empirical research done on minimum wage increases. We've had them for years, and certain states are allowed, in fact, states are allowed to increase their minimum wages above the federal minimum wage. So we've got a lot of experiments where you can do and see what happened in a state that raised its minimum wage above the federal minimum versus those states that kept at the wage at the federal minimum. And what we found is that modest increases in the minimum wage, talking about going from, right now, the federal minimum is $7.25. Can you believe it? I mean, if it just kept up with inflation from 1968, it would be way over $10.60, close to $11 an hour today. But what we know is that it has not had negative effects on employment, and also, if anything, it's pushed up salaried workers' wages slightly. It's been good for the economy because minimum wage workers who have more money, they can turn around and buy stuff, and their buying has a multiplier effect in the economy, generates more jobs and more economic activity. David Arturi, why hasn't an indexed formula for minimum wage been adopted? Wages could be negotiated at a fixed percent above the minimum and then adjusted for inflation. David, I would completely agree with you. I think there ought to be a minimum wage that is adjusted for inflation automatically. I think it's crazy to go through these fights every 4 or 5 or 10 years with regard to raising the minimum wage. And finally, Cindy Kelly, why is Trump so ham-fisted when he tries to provide condolences? Well, Cindy, you're talking, I assume, about the latest contretemps over what Trump said or failed to say to the widow of the fallen troop, the fallen soldier. But also, I assume you're talking about Trump's ham-fistedness with regard to Puerto Rico and Houston and everything else and any prince else that needs condolences. I mean, this is a man. Here's the issue. This is a man who is a pathological narcissist. And what we know, I'm not a psychologist, but what we know, the little we know about narcissists, pathological narcissists, is that they don't have any empathy. And so what we see over and over again, and I think this is what's driving people crazy, is that Donald Trump is mentally, emotionally, psychologically incapable of providing people with comfort, of giving any kind of condolence, giving any kind of comfort to the country. And I suggest that this is really behind a lot of what we're now seeing and a lot of the anger that a lot of people feel toward Trump in this instance. Well, what are we going to do about it, folks? What we're going to do about it, at the very least, is make sure that there are enough members of Congress, starting in January of 2019, who are committed to getting Trump out of the presidency, who will remove him under impeachment, and we have plenty of grounds for impeachment. We don't have time tonight to go through those. I've gone through them with you before. I'll go through them again with you. But we also have the 25th Amendment, and I think there are more and more pieces of evidence, more and more reasons for believing that Donald Trump should be removed because he doesn't have the capacity, the mental and emotional capacity to be president. So the 25th Amendment, which has never been used, ought to be used. We'll talk about it in the future, but what this means for you, just one little final word. Many of you are already working hard. You are working in your indivisible groups. You're working in your grassroots groups. You're working to make sure that this country reflects our values. And when I say our, I don't mean democratic small, capital D. I mean democratic small d. I mean values having to do with social solidarity. We are all part of this country. We owe each other obligations as citizens, as members of the same society. We know that. And what Donald Trump is trying to do is divide us. We're not going to allow that. You're not going to allow that. You are already active. If you're not active, please become engaged. Please become active. This is our country. This is our responsibility. Thank you for tuning in. I want to just thank Andrew Santana, Kyle Parker, and also Sasha Lightman for doing such a terrific job. See you soon.